Did Ferrari just sabotage their own legend? After Hamilton's overwhelming domination in the Barcelona tests, using older components and receiving less technical support, fans and insiders alike are asking the question no one at Ferrari dares to answer aloud. Was Leclarque being protected at the cost of performance? Data shows Hamilton outpaced his teammate in every meaningful category, despite being handed second-tier resources. Engineers are quietly switching sides, strategists are changing their language, and for the first time in years, Leclerc's status as team leader is under serious threat. If the numbers do not lie, then who does? And more importantly, how long can Ferrari continue to bury the truth before their internal bias costs them everything? In the calm before the storm, while the official spotlight of the championship remained dimmed, all eyes unexpectedly turned to Barcelona, where behind closed gates and away from the glitz of television cameras, a series of private test sessions revealed more than just lap times. They revealed a power shift. In a turn of events that left engineers stunned and insiders whispering, Hamilton delivered a series of performances so dominant, so surgically precise, that they shattered internal benchmarks and left his teammate Leclarque visibly rattled. These were not just impressive runs, they were statements. Real, timed, and data-verified laps that showed Hamilton had found something in the car no one else could. Sector after sector, his telemetry read like a masterclass. Consistent throttle modulation, near-perfect tire load distribution, and braking points that defied the expected decay of the medium compound. While most drivers treat testing as a data collection formality, Hamilton approached it like a proving ground. An opportunity not just to tune the car, but to silence a narrative that had followed him all season. What makes this all the more shocking is how these results emerged after months of whispers that Hamilton had been receiving suboptimal equipment and support. But on that quiet circuit in Catalunya, there was no hiding behind setup excuses or political favoritism. The telemetry screens told the truth in full color, and the numbers were staggering. One engineer, speaking anonymously, admitted that Leclerc's data looked flat by comparison, lacking pace, unstable in high-speed corners, and notably inefficient in energy recovery on longer stints. "You cannot fake that," the source said. "This is not about team orders or pit wall strategies. This is raw driving and mechanical harmony, and Hamilton just humiliated everyone, Leclarque included." The mood inside Ferrari was reportedly tense by the afternoon of the second day. Technical staff previously assigned to Leclarque were quietly seen requesting access to Hamilton's run data, hoping to decode what they had clearly underestimated. But by then, the statement had already been made. After months of implied inferiority, Hamilton had used testing, often overlooked and dismissed by media, to remind Ferrari, and perhaps the entire Formula One world, that he was not only still capable but still better. In a sport where perception often outruns performance, the facts from Barcelona could not be spun. Hamilton dominated, and Leclerc, despite every internal advantage, was left exposed. As word of Hamilton's dominance in the Barcelona testing spread beyond the confines of the paddock, it began to disrupt the tightly curated narrative Ferrari had worked to project since the start of the season. For months, subtle cues, carefully edited social media posts, controlled press statements, and an unmistakable emphasis on Leclerc as the future, had created a perception of shifting power within the team. But perception, as Hamilton proved on that Spanish circuit, crumbles in the face of reality. The reality was this: given equal machinery and clean data, Hamilton remained faster, sharper, and mentally untouchable. Even more impressive was how he achieved these results while continuing to operate within a garage that, according to insiders, still favored Leclerc with newer components and prioritized simulations based on his driving style. Technicians close to the telemetry analysis revealed that Hamilton's inputs during test runs delivered more consistent data than Leclerc's, with fewer fluctuations in torque demand and a more refined approach to energy recovery systems. This was not simply raw speed, it was the efficiency of a master craftsman. In corner exits where Leclerc struggled to stabilize, Hamilton exited with grip preservation, so precise that tire degradation across stints remained almost negligible. Engineers were left baffled, not because they did not expect Hamilton to be fast, but because they had not anticipated him to dismantle every comparative metric. This led to an awkward but necessary series of internal reviews. Why had Leclerc, the driver long treated as the team's axis, failed to produce anything remotely close? Perhaps the most telling moment came during the debrief at the end of the second day. According to sources who attended the session, silence followed the review of the overlay between both drivers. One staff member described the atmosphere as heavy with denial, a moment when favoritism collided with undeniable truth. Hamilton did not gloat. He sat quietly, listening, allowing the data to speak on his behalf. His calm presence only intensified the discomfort of those who had, perhaps for too long, invested in the idea that his best years were behind him. If testing was meant to be low profile, This session had done the opposite. It had ripped open the assumptions many inside Ferrari were hoping to maintain until season's end. What truly elevated the Barcelona tests from impressive to incendiary was not just the performance gap between Hamilton and Leclarque, but how clearly that gap exposed the internal dysfunctions long whispered about within Ferrari. For the first time, multiple analysts and technical consultants, both inside and adjacent to the team, began to openly question the logic behind the team's ongoing development strategy. If Hamilton could outperform with equipment believed to be less advanced or deliberately less prioritized, what did that say about the actual meritocracy of the setup process? Was the team building a car around performance or around preference? And if the latter, how much potential had been left on the table in pursuit of preserving a politically convenient hierarchy? Several experienced engineers who had worked with Hamilton in his previous teams noted a distinct pattern. They described how he often adapted to difficult setups not by complaining, but by absorbing data, suggesting incremental adjustments, and adjusting his driving style in subtle but effective ways. That very adaptability, the ability to outthink the car, was on full display in Barcelona. It was not that Hamilton was given a car that perfectly suited him. Quite the opposite. It is believed that at least 2 of his stints were completed using a chassis version initially discarded during early season development. And yet, he turned laps that undercut Leclerc's best efforts by over half a second in several instances. In Formula One terms, that is not a margin, it is a chasm. What made these revelations even more difficult for Ferrari's internal structure to stomach was how transparently they spread beyond the team. Independent data aggregators who monitor GPS traces and timing loops during closed sessions began to publish anonymized comparisons. Even with identities redacted, the industry could read between the lines. Analysts at Motorsport Italia and Race Intelligence UK highlighted specific corners, Turn 3 and Turn 9 especially, where the driver line was not just cleaner but bolder, suggesting a confidence in car balance and tire grip that only one driver had found. It did not take long for followers to correctly identify Hamilton as that driver. The fanbase responded with an energy that Ferrari could neither contain nor control, flooding forums and digital timelines with graphs, overlays, and one unshakable conclusion: the wrong driver was being favored. Behind the scenes, the aftermath of the Barcelona test sessions began to stir deeper tensions within Ferrari. While outwardly the team maintained its characteristic stoicism, internally the garage was fractured. Junior mechanics whispered about the shift in mood around Leclarque, who reportedly grew distant after reviewing the post-session data. Unlike previous test programs where he was treated as the natural center of attention, this time the focus had drifted unmistakably toward Hamilton, and not because of political maneuvering or press manipulation, but because of undeniable, tangible superiority on track. This change in dynamic rattled not just the driver hierarchy, but also the internal support structures that had quietly but consistently tilted in Leclerc's favor throughout the season. Several longtime observers of the team's operations noted how even before the testing, there were signs of imbalance in the way resources were distributed. Tire choices, test runs during simulator days, and even the attention given by race engineers often seemed to lean towards reinforcing Leclerc's comfort zone. Hamilton, as has often been the case in his career, operated with less overt support, relying instead on experience, meticulous preparation, and his uncanny ability to extract performance from imperfect setups. This time, however, the imbalance was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. The parts used by Hamilton during the tests included several components previously marked as mid-cycle or non-preferential, meaning they were either older versions or designs not initially allocated to the main driver. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Hamilton demonstrated a profound ability to read the car, managing tire load and energy recovery with surgical precision across each stint. The psychological effect of this performance within the team cannot be overstated. According to insiders, some technical staff who had long prioritized Leclerc's car began quietly requesting access to Hamilton's telemetry. Not for comparison, but for study. It was as if the myth of Leclerc's ascendancy had been momentarily stripped bare, and for the first time in months, the garage was looking to Hamilton for answers. Not just because he was fast, but because he was right. His feedback, once given only measured attention, suddenly carried a new weight. We realized, one engineer reportedly said, that we had been asking the wrong questions to the wrong driver. This marked a pivotal shift, not only in performance but in perception. Testing in Barcelona had been intended as routine preparation, a minor technical exercise in a long season. Instead, it became a turning point. Hamilton, through discipline and undeniable speed, forced a recalibration of internal loyalties. Leclarque was not dethroned by politics or press. He was outclassed on the stopwatch. As the dust settled on the test days in Barcelona, the broader motorsport community began to digest what had occurred. not just in terms of lap times, but in how Hamilton had systematically dismantled a narrative that had long been curated by both internal politics and external media. For much of the current era, the Formula One paddock has operated under the assumption that the rise of younger talents like Leclarque signals an inevitable passing of the torch. Yet, what Hamilton achieved in those untelevised sessions turned that assumption into a question mark. He did not just outperform, he exposed. With precision and calm defiance, he peeled back the surface of a team whose commitment to meritocracy had, at best, become questionable. The industry, always quick to detect patterns, could no longer overlook the facts. Hamilton was faster, and Leclarque was now the one chasing shadows. In press rooms across Europe, murmurs began to surface. Analysts from Sky Motorsport Alemania to Autosport Italia questioned whether Ferrari had misjudged their own driver balance. Some went further, calling it the most clear-cut example of strategic blindness in recent memory. These were not simply hot takes from opinionated pundits. These were conclusions drawn from independent sector analysis and lap time distributions sourced directly from test circuit telemetry. What they found was consistent and shocking. Hamilton's performance did not depend on short-run setups or low-fuel glory runs. Instead, his longest stints, on both the medium and hard compounds, showed degradation curves more favorable than Leclerc's across identical temperature windows. That level of consistency, across changing track conditions, is the gold standard in Formula One testing. And Hamilton had delivered it with fewer engineer-led adjustments, fewer radio interventions, and crucially, with a car configuration designed originally for his teammate. This revelation sparked uncomfortable reflections within Ferrari. Some high-ranking personnel who had been firm advocates for pushing Leclarque as the team's long-term asset reportedly began expressing concern behind closed doors. Their calculations had been rooted in the assumption that Hamilton, though experienced and highly skilled, was entering a phase of graceful decline. But now, with the Barcelona tests dismantling that belief in full view, they were forced to reckon with a scenario they had not planned for. Hamilton in peak form, commanding respect not just from fans or media, but from their own engineers. The political convenience of supporting the younger star had begun to show cracks, as technical departments scrambled to justify why they had not allocated their best resources to the driver producing the best results. Inside the Ferrari garage, where the scent of burning rubber and the hum of precision machinery usually drown out human drama, a far more subtle storm was brewing. One measured not in decibels but in glances, shifting loyalties, and careful recalibrations. What Hamilton had achieved in Barcelona was beginning to resonate beyond mere performance metrics. The psychological ripple effect within the team was undeniable. Engineers who once defaulted to Leclerc's preferences when tuning setups were now quietly reviewing Hamilton's feedback first. Some even began modifying simulation models, using Hamilton's braking data as the new benchmark. These actions were not born out of sentiment, they were born out of numbers. Cold, unquestionable numbers. It was also within this context that conversations about trust and fairness intensified. Though not publicly acknowledged, those within Ferrari's operations knew that certain parts, be it aerodynamic elements, power unit modes, or newly developed dampers, had been historically scheduled for Leclerc before Hamilton. In fact, during the Barcelona sessions, Hamilton was still operating without several of the latest spec floor upgrades that had been allocated exclusively to Leclerc. Yet, even with a hardware deficit, Hamilton emerged as the more complete driver. This triggered a quiet but telling internal audit of how decisions were being made and on what basis. Some insiders described it as an unofficial reckoning, where the political ecosystem of the team was being weighed against pure performance. Meanwhile, in the media lounges and fan forums, speculation intensified. Supporters of Hamilton began pointing fingers at a system that seemed rigged to downplay his brilliance. Hashtags surged. Side-by-side footage from anonymous sources surfaced online, comparing car behavior through critical corners. The images were damning, not because Leclerc made mistakes, but because Hamilton made none, despite working with older components and carrying additional weight in certain configurations. The silence from the team's leadership only fueled the suspicion that favoritism had backfired. And while Leclerc maintained a measured public demeanor behind the scenes, he was reportedly frustrated, grappling with the reality that the man many had assumed was nearing the twilight of his career had just reasserted dominance with no verbal warnings. Only lap times. Perhaps the most telling development was how quickly external teams began to take notice. Engineers from rival outfits reportedly approached Ferrari staff during social events, asking informal but pointed questions. What spec was Hamilton running? And why was he not given the same updates? These were not gossipy provocations. They were the kinds of questions that suggest even competitors recognize the imbalance and its implications. In Formula One, perception often drives decision-making as much as data. And right now, the perception across the paddock was that Ferrari had underestimated the wrong driver. As the paddock processed the fallout from Barcelona, an uncomfortable truth began to cement itself across conversations both private and public. Hamilton was no longer just the veteran presence at Ferrari. He had become the measuring stick. What once was seen as a generational transition, a seamless handover of leadership from one iconic name to another, was now a contested throne. And unlike in seasons past, this was not a conflict stoked by press conferences or clashing personalities. This was a purely technical, purely undeniable reckoning born from data and results. Even long-standing insiders, who had once believed Hamilton was at the tail end of his championship-caliber years, began revising their internal projections. Several engineers were overheard referring to him not only as the most consistent driver in the garage, but also the most intellectually engaged. It was not just speed, it was method. The broader implications were equally disruptive. Sponsorship analysts tracking fan sentiment noted a dramatic spike in engagement following Hamilton's testing dominance. Marketing departments within Ferrari quietly reevaluated their branding content, which had for months revolved almost exclusively around Leclarque. Suddenly, archive clips of Hamilton's telemetry breakdowns and radio exchanges from older races were circulating again, this time reframed as evidence of his enduring mastery. Meanwhile, commentators across Europe began publishing opinion pieces that asked uncomfortable but necessary questions. Why had the team prioritized optics over output? Why had someone who delivered so consistently been treated as the second narrative? Inside the team, tensions simmered with a quiet urgency. Leclarque, though outwardly professional, had grown noticeably withdrawn. According to several staff members, his usual engagement in debrief sessions had dulled, replaced by curt answers and subtle impatience. The dynamic had shifted. Where once he had been the center of technical discussions, now engineers deferred more often to Hamilton's data. At one point, a lead strategist was said to have responded to a tire where discrepancy by asking, "What did Hamilton do through Sector 2?" That single line, small, almost benign, symbolized the new reality. The team was no longer just building a car around a rising star. They were now questioning whether they had ever truly built it around the right one. This pivot caused a subtle reshuffling in garage assignments and meeting allocations. Personnel who had previously worked exclusively on Leclerc's side of the garage were quietly redistributed to assist on Hamilton's car during upcoming simulations. This was not announced nor publicly acknowledged, but in the world of Formula One, actions speak louder than press statements. Those in the know began to whisper that Ferrari was preparing for a scenario few had expected. One where Hamilton might not only outperform, but once again become the undisputed lead driver. Not because of politics or pressure, but because he had simply left them no other choice. As Ferrari scrambled to realign their strategy following the Barcelona test, the implications of their choices became crystal clear to anyone paying attention. What had initially seemed like a temporary misstep, the underperformance of Leclerc compared to Hamilton, had now evolved into a much larger issue of trust and leadership within the team. Every corner of the paddock, from rival engineers to longtime commentators, had recognized the monumental shift that had occurred. Hamilton, in a season that had been expected to be his last strong push, had not only proved his critics wrong, but had also reignited questions about team dynamics and leadership. He had managed to do what no one had expected: challenge Leclerc not just for a title, but for the very narrative of Ferrari's future. For Leclerc, the reality of Hamilton's sudden rise had become even harder to ignore. Although he remained the official number one, there was no escaping the fact that he was now the one playing catch-up. The numbers were clear. Hamilton had outperformed on every possible metric, and even the most hardened of Ferrari's supporters couldn't hide their surprise. As the team prepared for the remainder of the season, they knew they faced a tough decision. Could they keep pretending that the balance of power was still in Leclerc's hands, or would they need to embrace the reality that their priorities had shifted? Some within the team saw the answer as inevitable. If they didn't adapt, they risked losing everything, starting with the man who had just proven that, despite all odds, he was still the man to beat. Publicly, Hamilton remained as composed as ever, keeping his focus on the job at hand. But behind closed doors, his confidence had reached a new high. He knew that Ferrari was now under pressure to acknowledge his performance, whether they liked it or not. And though Leclerc maintained his usual poise in interviews, sources within his circle hinted at the growing strain. The once effortless aura of supremacy that had surrounded him seemed increasingly fractured. As Hamilton prepared for the next stage of the season, the test in Barcelona would go down in history as the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just about a car. It was about a legacy. It was about proving to everyone, his critics, his teammates, and even himself, that the fire was still burning. With Leclerc's grip on the team now uncertain, Hamilton had made it clear. The The battle for supremacy was far from over, and the outcome, while still unclear, would no longer be taken for granted. Let me know if you need any further changes or additions.